to segment 4.4. We'll now start our discussion on distinctiveness. So up until this point, we've been looking at some of the different categories the trademarks may fall in to qualify for that protection. Now we're going to talk about what actually causes a mark or a logo or any of these related classifications of trademarks to become distinctive. So for this, you read a case, I'm on page 182 of the textbook, in relation to the Walmart versus Samra Brothers case. And this actually dealt with a case specifically with relation to children's clothing. In fact, it was a one-piece seersucker outfit decorated with appliques of hearts, flowers, fruits, and the like. And you can actually look online to get a sense as to what these little dresses actually related to. But I have two questions for you. And the first one is, how may a name, product, etc. qualify as being distinctive? And when we talk about something being distinct, often it is in relation to whether or not it is causing you to think of a source of the goods. And in this case, for example, they talk about later on about whether or not something can be, quote, inherently distinctive. Whether or not, for example, there are some names that absolutely have nothing to do with anything, and just based off of that alone, they may be construed as being inherently distinctive. Now, that being said though, if something is not inherently distinctive, you see on page 184, top paragraph, now the court discusses how it is that they may develop secondary meaning to have a solid foundation itself. And so, and the point of this is they went on to say, for example, that the secondary meaning may allow the goods to be distinguished from other goods. Now that's important, but keep in mind that one of the main points that we have trademarks is so that we can actually identify a source. So going back to the question, how may a name, product, etc. be construed as distinctive? The court went on to indicate that, for example, color is not something that is inherently distinctive. In other words, it relies on some secondary consideration in order for it to then qualify for some level of distinctiveness. So how can a name, a color, things of that nature acquire, for example, distinctiveness? The name itself may be inherently distinctive just based off of it's a very weird name and nobody uses it. But a color or a sound or a smell or something of that nature may only indicate the source based off of consumers' understanding of that color, scent, sound associated with the source. For example, if I indicate the color green, you may not necessarily be thinking of anything in particular, but you may think of John Deere. Or if I mention T-Mobile, you may automatically think of the color pink. So the fact that you associate a company or a color with the source, namely the company itself, may be indicative the secondary consideration has in fact been established. And that's the main thing that we look at with respect to distinctiveness is the secondary consideration simply asks the question whether or not the unique feature, the color, the scent, the sound, actually has acquired some meaning with respect to the average consumer. And if it has, namely whether or not secondary considerations have been satisfied, then it may then allow the actual color, scent, sound to be construed as being distinct. So this is, you have inherently distinctive, which is almost, you can think of something that is inherently or innately distinct. And you have other items that may acquire a level of distinctiveness based off of secondary considerations. Second question is, how is color like product design? And from that point of view, we have discussed a little bit about how it is that product design may rely on secondary considerations as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and dig into some of the slides for this lecture. And I would like to start a little bit with respect to a video here that looks at some of the distinctiveness features and requirements. So let's start with this.
What is the purpose of the distinctiveness requirement for trademarks? The fundamental requirement for a trademark is distinctiveness. This requirement is analogous to the requirement for novelty in patent rights and originality in copyright. Without distinctiveness, there can be no trademark. As Miller and Davis note, naturally, a trademark must be distinctive if it is to serve the function of identifying the origin of goods and thereby avoid confusion, deception, or mistake. If a trademark is to protect purchasers from confusion over what they are purchasing, then the trademark somehow must be recognizable, identifiable, and different from other marks. Some trade and service marks achieve distinction via their inherent nature. Nike's curved swoosh checkmark suggesting speed and agility, for example. But other marks gain distinctiveness as a result of marketing, forming a powerful association over time in the minds of consumers. For example, the term Raisin Bran is merely descriptive of the cereal and would not be eligible for trademark registration had Kellogg Company not demonstrated through evidence of use, including sales, advertising expenditures, and consumer surveys, that the buying public had come to associate Raisin Bran with this particular Kellogg cereal. The public's distinct association of a trademark with a company is known as secondary meaning, and it can only be established over time. How is distinctiveness determined? In the 1976 case, Abercrombie & Fitch Company versus Hunting World Inc., Judge Henry Jacob Friendly established a 5-category spectrum of distinctiveness: fanciful marks, arbitrary marks, suggestive marks, descriptive marks, and generic marks. Judge Friendly's spectrum ranges from words and symbols invented solely to distinguish a product or vendor to words and symbols common enough to be ineligible for trademark protection. Fanciful marks are invented words, symbols, or devices that have no relation to the good or service being sold and have no meaning other than to distinctly identify the product or service and distinguish it from those of any other vendor. Some examples of fanciful marks are Xerox, Google, and Kodak. Fanciful marks are considered the strongest type of mark and are automatically registrable with the USPTO. Arbitrary marks are real words in common usage that have no descriptive relationship to the product or service being sold. Examples of arbitrary marks include Apple for the computer company and Galaxy for the mobile phone. Arbitrary marks are also unreservedly eligible for trademark registration. Suggestive marks are marks that imply a quality or characteristic of the goods and services being sold. Examples include iPad for the tablet computer and Coppertone for the sunscreen lotion. While suggestive marks are inherently registrable, any less distinctive marks would require evidence to indicate a secondary meaning. A descriptive mark explicitly describes the purpose, nature, or an attribute of a product or service, and are, therefore, not eligible for trademark registration unless a secondary meaning or association has been developed in the public's mind through usage. Ineligible descriptive marks include lightweight and faster. However, if a descriptive mark takes on a secondary meaning in the public mind, Sharp televisions, for example, or Windows for windowing software, then it can be eligible for trademark registration. The bar against descriptive marks is designed to protect common concepts and language that everyone needs to use. Imagine having to pay the coiner of the term reverse mortgage every time you wanted to describe such a financial arrangement. It would create a nightmare of social costs, which can be prevented simply by keeping the term in the public domain. The bar against descriptive marks spotlights the social purpose of trademarks, which is to prevent fraud and confusion in the market while protecting against any monopolies. The last and least distinctive category of marks are generic marks that are simply the common name for the goods and services being sold. An example of a generic mark might be the use of the word baskets for a basket store without any accompanying logo or design element to distinguish from a generic description of the items sold. A generic mark is never eligible for registration, no matter how much evidence a mark owner offers that it has acquired a secondary meaning through advertising and marketing. Ironically, a product or service can become so familiar in the marketplace that the public begins to associate its trademark with an entire category of similar products and services. When this happens, a valid trademark can become a generic name and the trademark will be lost, as happened with both cellophane and aspirin. Companies like Kleenex, Xerox, and more recently, Google have gone to great legal and advertising expense to prevent the generic misuse of their trademarks so these remain valid. Adobe, for example, sent emails to many web authors advising them to discontinue using the term Photoshopped and instead say that their photos were modified by Adobe Photoshop software.
So I like that brief overview because it allows you to see that there is very much a spectrum here. 5 different categories by which distinctiveness is actually analyzed, and we will look at some of these as well. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind that the goal here is to move along this spectrum towards stronger trademark protection, and that's the goal of trademark law. The more that your mark is in the descriptive category or further along the end, where if your mark is now being used to no longer identify the source of the goods, but is just being used, let's say, as a verb in a more generic fashion, then that in fact may cause your trademark to suffer genericide, where it becomes generic. And if that's the case, then you lose all protection to it. So marks can change in this level of distinctiveness over time, and the goal is to keep it in as strong a spectrum as possible, or as strong category as possible in that spectrum as time goes by. So as far as to qualify as a mark, this symbol must actually be distinctive, and in some of the cases that we've looked at, we have specifically analyzed what is necessary to receive distinct type nature. So in the last case, we looked at whether or not color, what was necessary in order for it, for example, to be construed as being distinct. And the goal of all this is that it must identify a goods or services. Namely, it is being used to identify a source of that which you are buying. And the social utility here is that if it is not distinctive, it does not cause consumer confidence. And that's the whole point of this, is that if the consumers have confidence as to the source of what it is that they're buying, that confidence will increase, namely the trust factor between the consumers and the companies will be more established. So the Walmart case, as we discussed, they sold children's clothing, and Walmart would send the photos of Samara's garments to Judy, which was in the Philippines. And then Judy Philippine would reproduce the garments, which were subsequently sold by Walmart at a lower price than authorized distributors of Samara garments. So in other words, Walmart took photos of Samara. Walmart behind the scenes had the clothing made at a cheaper price that undercut what it is that Samara could actually provide. District Court came back and found that they found in favor of Samara, and the Court of Appeals actually affirmed that as well. So one of the things that we see from this is, how is a mark distinctive according to this case? And there's two things I want to pull out here. First, a mark is inherently distinctive, and this goes a little bit back to the discussion we had at the start of our lecture, is if its intrinsic nature serves to identify a particular source. Again, it's going back to this fundamental understanding of trademarks, namely identification of source. In the context of word marks, courts have applied the now classic test originally formulated by Judge Friendly, in which word marks that are arbitrary, think of Camel cigarettes, fanciful, think of Kodak type film, or suggestive, Tide, are held to be inherently distinctive. So those first 3 categories within this 5 category spectrum of distinctiveness, the first 3, namely one that is arbitrary, one that is fanciful, or one that is suggestive, each of those would be construed as being inherently distinctive in some manner. The last 2 ones, the farthest category obviously is where it's suffering, it's losing the protection. The second one is where it's potentially descriptive. But a mark, and this is the second quote here, a mark may acquire distinctiveness, may have acquired distinctiveness, even if it is not inherently distinctive, if it has developed secondary meaning, which occurs when, in the minds of the public, the primary significance of a mark is to identify the source of the product rather than the product itself. So this notion that a mark can actually acquire distinctiveness goes back to, again, whether or not there is a meaning in the minds of the consumer with respect to what it is that is being provided in terms of the mark. So the reasoning here, the court indicated that the trade dress that the dress itself would likely not be inherently distinctive. And for example, a design is not necessarily for a source of identification alone. But they held that in action of infringement of unregistered trade dress, a product's design is distinctive. Now that's important, because if it is distinctive, it can acquire that level of protection based off of secondary meaning. So it's not inherently distinctive, but it is one that can acquire distinctiveness through this secondary meaning. So let's talk briefly about these inherently distinctive type marks: arbitrary, fanciful, and suggestive. And these are defined as marks that, standing by themselves, are sufficiently distinctive to qualify for protection. In other words, they don't need to show any other evidence or any other secondary type considerations, because the mark itself is sufficiently distinctive by itself. So you can almost think of it that it is distinct enough. I don't want to keep on using the same word distinct, but that is very much what this test of distinctiveness is looking at. It is distinct enough by itself that we can actually provide some protection for it. Acquired distinctiveness marks may acquire, again, distinctiveness based off its secondary meaning. Now this may include, for example, misdescriptive terms, colors used as marks, product design, trade dress design, surnames, geographic marks. All these, for example, by themselves may not be construed as inherently distinctive, but over time may in fact acquire secondary considerations or secondary meaning, which would allow it to qualify for distinctiveness. The generic terms, so keep in mind on our spectrum here, the first three categories are inherently distinctive, then we have acquired distinctiveness, and then we have essentially marks that have lost distinctiveness. And these are generic marks. And generic marks are marks that designate the category of a market rather than one specific provider of such products. And these are not protectable as marks. So let's go into, I think, I'll give you some examples for each of these so it may be a little bit clearer. But some questions to ask include, is this symbol one that a single seller should have the exclusive right to use a mark, or one that all sellers should be able to use? And if, for example, we answer yes to the first question, where it makes sense for a single seller to have this particular mark, then it's likely in this inherently distinctive category. That being said, if after time it makes sense for a single seller to have that mark, that might be reflective of secondary meaning by which they have acquired distinctiveness. Now the focus here is on competition and not simply the mechanics or the semantics of a mark. And the idea here obviously is that we want to keep the market as free as possible. We want to encourage competition, but if we suddenly give, let's say, two emerging companies were coming out and one was granted rights to a mark at the detriment of the other, well, unless this other company has already acquired some distinct nature for that mark that identifies squarely that company, then we may not want to tie up the market by endangering this other company from being able to compete at a similar type level. So in other words, for example, let's say that we're dealing with the market of hula hoops. And you have hula hoop company 1 and you have hula hoop company 2. And hula hoop company 1 says the name of our company is Red Hula Hoops. And the trademark office will look at this and say, well, if we grant them the trademark for Red Hula Hoops, that may be at the detriment of hula hoop company number 2, because they are also a hula hoop company and they also sell red hula hoops also. So this is very much a question as to, one, in the minds of the consumer, when they hear the term red hula hoop, are they really thinking of company 1, or are they just thinking generally of hula hoops? But 2, they're also looking at the question of competition, namely hula hoop company 1 in competition with hula hoop company 2, and if they grant some type of rights to hula hoop company 1, will that endanger the competition that should be flowing between those two companies?